Well, good afternoon. Today we're in Psalm chapter 90. If you're familiar with this psalm at all, it's probably because you've heard it so oftentimes at funerals. For example, in verse number 10, the days of our year are 60 years and 10. And if by reason of strength they be fourscore years, that is 80 years old, yet in their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. So in verse number 11 it says, Who knoweth the power of thine anger, even according to thy fear, as it is to thy wrath? Then verse number 12, which is the verse that we probably remember best, he says, So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts to wisdom. Now, when we look at that verse, of course, we're reminded of the brevity of life. James, of course, said in James chapter 4, in verse 13, that go to now that ye say, and here's the presumptuous of those who are speaking, today or tomorrow we will go to such a city and do business, do this and do that. But he reminds us, whereas you know not what's on tomorrow, we don't even know what's going to happen the next day. And so many have found that out. So he'll say, Is not your life a vapor? That is, it appeareth a little time, and then it vanishes away. So James tells us what we really ought to say is, if it be the Lord's will, we shall live and do this or do that. So oftentimes that's what you hear, and it's absolutely correct. There is this business that life is so very, very short. And but I think what the writer is really trying to get us to understand in verse number 12, or let me read it again. So teach us to number our days. I don't think he's talking about weeks, months, and years necessarily, but that we have an understanding of our duration here. That's why he'll say a little bit later here in the same verse that we apply our hearts to wisdom. So now what is he saying? Well, I think what he's saying is that we should have understanding of our life, and not just simply the brevity of it, but that we understand and value those days. And Jesus talks about that so oftentimes, but in John chapter 9, you remember about verse 4, 5, and 6, he'll talk about the night cometh in which no man should work. And of course, that night is death. And so we are to work while it's day. And so we ought to have some understanding, not just of the brevity or shortness of life, but to value those days and utilize them to the best of our knowledge. Now, in the Psalms, he's not talking simply about doing things that are worthwhile or accomplishing things in life, and not that they're meaningless, but what he's trying to teach us here is to number our days and value them in relationship to God. Because if you read the psalm, what you're seeing in the first part of it is he's talking about God has been our dwelling place from generation to generation, and that God is stable. He's formed the mountains and so forth, and that from eternity to eternity and days to the Lord are but, a day. And so he's talking about to number and value our days in the relationship to God, because that's what really matters. And then if you read in the middle of the psalm, you're going to see that the reason that we have a very short time on this planet, that our days are brief, is because of God's anger. And the reason that that's brought up is because he's referring to that sin has brought forth death and this brevity of life and all the problems that come along with that. And so really what he's talking about in the Psalms is that We really value our life in relationship to God, not simply what we accomplish in this life. And there's things that we could talk about that since our days are brief, we ought to do things that really, really matter. But the thing we're believing you with today is the thing that the psalmist and what we ought to understand is of what great value is that is in our relationship to God. And then, of course, we can look beyond this very short, brief time on this earth. So I want you to think about that as we look at this particular psalm, and don't just think about it at the end of life, but what he's really talking about is we ought to know how to live life now, right? In this very present time as we still walk upon this earth. So those are some good thoughts, and you need to reflect upon them. And what do I really want to do is in the kingdom of God, and what do we want to accomplish for the Lord? Things that really, really last. So we'll be looking at Psalm chapter 92. I'm skipping 91 tomorrow because I'm thinking about something very, very important about that chapter I want to bring up next week in our or the week that I'm back in the sermon on a Sunday morning, that Lord's Day. And let me encourage you to be with us every Lord's Day as we worship God in the assembly, what we need to do. So, see you tomorrow, and we'll be looking at Psalm 92. See you then.